First thing is I feel a sense of return. I became active on the issue of nuclear weapons in the 1980s. I took a deliberate decision to become unemployed. I think this was the most frightening decision I've ever taken in my life. Because I believed at that point that the imminent possibility of nuclear war was far more important than to have a good job. That set me at odds with my family. It's summed up with a slogan on a railway that said, just one atomic bomb could ruin your entire day, distancing me from the life of consumerism, etc., etc. Then I went to Canada to do a PhD and returned to find at Greenpeace, where I previously worked at, that I was kind of the ancestor of the ancestors, that like Rip Van Winkle, I was there before the generation that was seen as the ancestors, and a very different organization. And at that point I met many people in this room, and I'm glad to see old faces, and but also saddened that this conversation continues, because in a way Trident is terribly boring. Now, after leaving Greenpeace, after the third Iraq War and the Trident issue coming up again, I have gone back into the past, 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, in which Britain became a great world power, and then passed that to the United States. And so if I'm a bit ignorant about one or two of the current things, imagine sort of coming out of that. But I'm going to speak quite quickly, but I'm going to ask your patience because I have Parkinson's disease, and so at times I may have to go over things twice. Okay. The first thing I want to say, really, I've just moved to Edinburgh, and I think of Lady Macbeth, and the famous is a statement, out, damn spot, not all the perfumes of Arabia could sweeten this little hand. Britain, what is Britain? My father was proud to be British. I, in many ways, am proud to be British. But first of all, Britain is an imagined community. We never meet many of the people who we regard as British. That imagined community in many ways came into being out of war. We all know like the terse phrase of Armstrong as he stepped out of the Eagle Lander, one small step for a man, one giant step for mankind. It's a terse statement that echoes that of British commanders in the Navy, who would say right back to the Naval Gazette, saying things such as wind rising, today lost such and such ships, but victorious, etc., etc. Very terse, and giving a sense of being in the middle of the action. You're there on the ship and participating. Now, that of course went through the Naval Gazette and the national press in the sense of being other people reading it at the same time. This imagined community. And of course, you know, later we have Churchill's broadcasts and so forth. That imagined community, I think, is in deep trouble. And I put it very basically, it cannot look itself in the face. And I think for several reasons. Firstly, where is the real locus of power in this country? Well, in many ways, you might say it's located in part in the House of Saud, that we have, the US has a relationship with the House of Saud, where they said, we will back up your archaic kingdom and you give us the oil. So we have not a situation of the spread of freedom and democracy, but rather a kind of pseudo-freedom and democracy going hand in hand with putting up the most archaic violence and nastiness. And we've come into that in a subordinate way because the US Congress at various points was not willing to sell various armaments to the House of Saud, and you know, we hear that the special branch, whatever, cannot investigate further into various corruptions. We cannot look ourselves in the face. And I think there are various other aspects of this. I've just moved to Edinburgh, and you see there that the poverty of Glasgow and the fact that we destroyed what was at one time a shipbuilding industry that made 90% of the world's shipping. We now know this is not necessary, that at the time of the closures it was identified that there was a future for the British ship industry in Glasgow. It lay in building what do you call it? There's giant things that tourists go on. They're horrible, but the Koreans got there first. And finally, Trident. Trident, if you think about it, and we look at how, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was carefully framed that this was in no way like a chemical weapon. And it was framed as being an act of defense. All this has been now revealed to be false. And most importantly, the way film was held back. We have followed with Trident. And Trident, you have to understand that Trident is an extraordinary weapon. It's not a deterrence weapon. It's far more than was ever needed for deterrence. Where did it come from? Well, very likely it came from squabbling between the US Navy and the Air Force over who was going to get the lion's share of the missile budget. So we bought a weapon that far outstripped our needs. Fast, accurate, very powerful, capable of hitting multiple targets. The US embassy at the time, perhaps with a bit of puff, said it could take the entire Soviet Union right across back into the Stone Age. Maybe, I don't know. But you get the point. Moreover, we're not prepared to actually look at what Trident has been made into. It has in part been made into a weapon which it has been regarded as usable by giving it the sub-strategic role. I'll come back to that. So, a national community that hides its nuclear weapons up in a remote loch in Scotland. It's actually not that remote, it's very close to Glasgow. But still, in terms of people's day-to-day living, they see it and they don't see it. Now, what's happening now? We're having, you might call it the break-up of this national community. I'm not a Scottish nationalist, but I certainly was involved in the placing of when uranium was sent, spent uranium was sent from Georgia to the Dounreay reprocessing plant, and it was clearly an act of internal colonization. Put it up there, and that took off at that point, and within a few days the Dounreay was closed. Similarly with Trident. The Scots are aware of it, and the corruption of such a weapon has enabled another imagined community, Scotland, to present itself or see itself as morally superior. And I think with other factors such as the National Health Service not being funded and so forth, that has now resulted in a split developing. And then that's echoed, not echoed, but in a different way with the Brit exit. We discover suddenly we are two nations. Well, actually, some of us who were looking at things knew that was happening quite some time ago. The press finally discovered it. So now this is the key point. We have a bizarre situation where we have spent billions on this weapon, replacement, the USSBNX, to defend a imagined national community that is crumbling before our eyes. This is truly bizarre. And I finally want to say something which may be somewhat controversial, but I believe may be true, and I put it maybe in the form of a question. We don't have a special relationship with the United States. We, an empire, persuaded them to take over the imperial task, and what we have is a relationship of subservience. Why? Why did I say that? Well, actually, this conference is an example of that, because we've been considering the issue of could the revolution, or what you call in undersea drones and so on, could that help us? Does that alter the issue with respect to boomers, as they're called? I share Paul's view that it probably doesn't actually. But actually, the real issue is not nice drones, as opposed to nasty ones to use on land, versus a USSBN. It's both. The United States has the capacity to fund both. And currently, I've been reading through the literature. They talk about how this is an area, see, where the US is dominant, and they mean to retain that dominance. So this is a US agenda, and that's what we're debating. What if we were to debate a British agenda? Well, here I go back and invoke the name of Jackie Fisher and his naval revolution. This was an extraordinary discovery for me, that we all know the story of Dreadnought, the great phrase, we don't want We don't want to go to war. But by jingo, if we do, we've got the money and we've got the guns too. So Jackie Fisher, we heard the story of the dreadnought race. The danger that Britain would be lose out on the high seas to the rapidly built German fleet. It turns out, and on that basis, large money was collected to build dreadnoughts. Well, actually, Jackie Fisher didn't believe a word of it, and convinced Churchill also that it was absolutely false, because he saw the possibility of the submarine and the torpedo and the torpedo boat, and he realized that if you develop these technologies, that it would be quite easy to deny space for an invasion. And then he concentrated on developing fast cruisers integrated with radio to control the sea lanes and to starve out an opponent. All this was deeply hidden and was at odds with the official Foreign Office strategy of freedom of the seas, etc., etc. And of course we executed that and we starved Germany. Now, the key point here is maybe today what a British strategy would involve using these very technologies of drones underwater to defend the UK national territory. That's very achievable. It's your own waters. And maybe we should be debating that. And it's in that context that I think we need to be cautious that actually we are enacting as a relationship of subordination with the United States. I have quite a bit more to say, but I'll leave it at that to be provocative. Well, no, I'm not really being provocative. I think there's a lot of truth in what I say, but that's for you to debate.
Yeah. Thank you, Dominic.
I wanted to go on to secrets, but maybe that'll come up in the questions.
Maybe it'll come up in the questions. Yeah. That would be good.